And then I'm going to go ahead, change the host, and I will be back shortly to go ahead and give the all clear.
Sounds good.
You can go ahead and begin this round. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Are the attorneys ready?
Your Honor, the plaintiff and my co-counsel is ready to go. If we may start with some opening matters and introduce ourselves.
Yes, give me just 1 second. I was making sure everybody was on. I'll do the little read-in. We just received the message to get started, so I'm going to call the case of the estate of Genesis Petrillo versus Peony Estates and Harper Martini. My name is Marilyn Brown. Scoring judges, if you would look to the 2 lower buttons on your screen and make sure that you keep your audio muted and your video off unless you're asked to come online. Everyone should also have their video set to hide all non-video participants, which means the only people on the screen right now should be myself as the judge and the advocates. Now would the attorneys please go ahead and make their appearances.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. My name is Joseph Giordana, and I represent the plaintiff. Before we make appearances, Your Honor, permission to approach and tender a few documents that might be helpful throughout today's trial. They include stipulations, special instructions, and relevant case law.
I have constructively received them from the tournament directors.
Yes, Your Honor. If I may direct your attention to stipulation 3, which states that exhibits 1 through 10 have already been pre-entered and admitted.
Let me get defense counsel's appearances first.
Yes, Your Honor.
Good morning, Your Honor, or good afternoon, Your Honor. My name is Matthew York, and I am joined today by my co-counsels, Ms. Rachel Polk.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
And Mr. Krishna Kanduri.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Together, we're advocating on behalf of the defendant, Ms. Harper Martini.
Okay.
Your Honor.
And the plaintiff had some housekeeping matters.
Yes, Your Honor, I did. If that's okay if I start going through them.
Yes.
Yeah, so just to redirect your attention to stipulation 3, just which states exhibits 1 through 10 have already been pre-entered and admitted. And then, Your Honor, if I could direct your attention to Rule 615, and we can invoke that, which states that constructively sequestering witnesses, excluding party representatives.
Consider that done.
Your Honor, if I can invoke Rule 603, which states that all witnesses are already pre-sworn in.
Okay.
Then next, Your Honor, can I direct your attention to relevant case law, specifically America's Best Cookie versus International House of Waffle, which states any out-of-court statement, even made by the witness themselves, is considered hearsay.
Okay.
Your Honor, I'd like to inquire if you have any preferences for constructively approaching witnesses.
Tell me what you mean by that.
Traditionally, like with it being on Zoom, I don't know if you'd like us to approach a witness or the opposing counsel witness or anything of that nature.
We'll assume that it's constructive.
Yes, Your Honor. Well, with that in place, I'd like to introduce my co-counsel, Priya Jain.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
And Pranil Jadhav.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
With that, Your Honor, the plaintiff is ready to begin.
Okay, is there anything before we get going from the defense side?
Yes, Your Honor. Seeing how this is our first time in your court, we would like to know if you would like us to ask permission for showing evidence on the screen for the purposes of showing the witness and opposing counsel.
If a document has been admitted already, you can show it on the screen without getting permission. If it hasn't yet been admitted and you're showing it to the witness to lay a foundation, then we will assume that you're doing so constructively without everybody else being able to see.
Okay. And at this time, I'd just like to draw your attention to case law. Burdett v. Copenhagen. This just defines the 3 elements of battery as an act by a defendant, an intent to cause harmful or offensive contact on the part of the defendant, and 3, harmful or offensive contact to the plaintiff.
Okay, I have that up on my screen. Is the plaintiff proceeding under the battery theory then?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, anything else before we get started?
Yes, Your Honor. I would just like to draw your attention to the case Defendifer v. Schroeder. In this case, the court ruled that the burden of proof for such a civil case is by a preponderance of evidence and lies solely on the plaintiff, not on the defense.
All right.
And with that, the defense is ready to proceed.
Okay. We will now hear opening statements from each party. Everyone should make sure that they are in speaker view, and attorneys, please remember to mute your audio when the other attorney is speaking.
May I begin with my opening statement, Your Honor?
Yes, counsel.
May it please the court. I am afraid Harper is going to kill me. This was one of Genesis Petrio's final statements before he died. June 8th, 2019, what was supposed to be the most magical day for Casey Soto and Genesis Petrio turned into the worst day of Casey's life when she found out that her beloved Genesis had passed away from pesticide poisoning. And members of the jury, this isn't any ordinary accidental poisoning case. This is a case of battery, which means that the defendant acted with the intent to cause harm. And we are here in court today because Genesis was intentionally poisoned by her soon-to-be mother-in-law, Harper Martini, because of the bad blood between Harper and Genesis. And that is simply what this case boils down to: bad blood. Let's go back a couple years to when Casey met Genesis, fell in love with Genesis, and made the mistake of introducing Genesis to her mother, Harper. The moment that Harper met Genesis, life was never the same again for Casey and Genesis, because that is when the bad blood began. Harper, being the clingy helicopter parent that she is, hated Genesis from the moment she met him and did everything in her power to keep Genesis away from Casey. Harper initially clung on to the hope that Casey and Genesis would break up and Genesis would be out of their lives forever. However, things took a turn for the worse when Casey and Genesis decided to get married, because at that moment, Harper knew she had to take matters into her own hands and do whatever it took to remove Genesis from Casey's life. Angel Rodriguez, Genesis's longtime best friend, will come on stand today and tell you how she constantly witnessed yelling and fighting between Harper and Genesis, especially as they were getting closer and closer to the wedding day. Harper was always criticizing or insulting Genesis and did anything she could to get rid of Genesis. Harper would repeatedly call Genesis a pest and talk about using a Genesis pesticide. On June 7th, 2019, about an hour before the rehearsal dinner, Angel witnessed Harper heading for the kitchen with a canister of pesticide. And when Angel asked Harper why she had the pesticide, she said, "It's for Genesis, because he is such a pest." And at the rehearsal dinner, Harper gave a bottle of Cara wine that she said was for Genesis and Genesis only. This Cara wine was the only bottle that Harper had in her kitchen and was given to Genesis because it was the bottle of wine that had been contaminated with pesticide that Harper had put in there with the intent to harm Genesis. And members of the jury, that is battery. On the night of June 7, 2019, Harper Martini acted with the intent to cause harm to Genesis Petrio. And after Genesis drank the Cara wine, he fell very sick that night and had to be rushed to the hospital. Dr. Jimin Kwan, the emergency physician that treated Genesis, will come on stand today and tell you how the only possible cause of death is organophosphate pesticide poisoning, because Genesis's symptoms matched up perfectly with this diagnosis. Now, as the plaintiff today, we hold the burden of proof, and the burden in today's case is by a preponderance of the evidence. This simply means it is more likely than not to have occurred. It is more likely than not that Harper Martini acted with the intent to mix pesticide in the wine that was given to Genesis Petrio with the intent to cause harm. To better understand this burden, visualize the scales of justice and place the evidence presented by each side on this scale. When you look at the scale, you will find bad blood weighing down one side. And as a result, we will ask you to find Harper Martini liable for battery.
Thank you, counsel. Defense?
May I proceed?
Yes.
May it please the court. Opposing counsel, members of the jury, there is no intent in an accident. Today we are here because the plaintiff is accusing a mother, Harper Martini, of poisoning her only child's fiance, Genesis Petrillo. This is far from the reality of today's case. Instead, Ms. Martini is a mother watching their child grieve the death of their fiance, which is one of the worst pains a mother could watch their child experience. You see, the plaintiff's story is missing something. What took place on June 8th, 2019 was tragic. And no one could have foreseen this tragic outcome because, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, there is no intent in an accident. Raising your child as a single mother is never easy. But Harper still managed to be at Casey's every soccer game and school play that she's ever had. When Casey became older, she met her fiance, Genesis. Now, Harper and Genesis didn't initially have the best relationship, just as many other relationships people have with their in-laws. But Harper still tried her best for Casey's happiness. She even offered to host their wedding at her winery, Peony Estates. Harper spent months planning the wedding and never intended for anything to go wrong on such a special day, because members of the jury, there is no intent in an accident. Miss Martini's winery, Peony Estates, had a pest problem because it's located near a swamp. While the employees of Peony Estates did sometimes keep pesticide in the wine bottling area and were sometimes careless with their practices, Miss Martini was not and did not intend on the harming of Genesis Petrillo. The evidence will show that on the night of the rehearsal dinner, Harper was so eager to make amends with Genesis that she offered him a bottle of Cara wine. Genesis happily accepted and enjoyed several glasses of the wine, even offering a glass to another member of the wedding party, Angel Rodriguez, who did not become sick. But once Genesis became noticeably too drunk, he was rushed to the hospital. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we do not know if it was pesticide that killed Genesis Petrillo. But even if it was due to the inattentive practices of Peony Estates, not Harper's anger. You will hear testimony today from 3 witnesses that will show you that Harper never intended to poison her soon-to-be son-in-law. First, you'll hear from Austin Lewis, a Peony Estates employee who will tell you that Peony Estates had questionable practices and received several health inspections from their health inspector and violations, meaning that even if it were true that pesticides were in the wine, it was from the inattentive practices of Peony Estates, not Harper's intent to harm Genesis Petrillo. Next, you will hear from Dr. Cannon, who will offer several other explanations for Genesis's death and tell you that there's no way that Miss Martini's actions could have caused it. Last, you will hear from Miss Martini herself, who will tell you that she never consistently held negative feelings toward Genesis and did everything she could to improve the relationship, proving that there was never an intent to harm Genesis. As you listen to the testimony today, listen to the problematic practices. Listen to the several alternative explanations for Genesis Petrillo's death, and listen to the lack of intent to harm Genesis Petrillo that Harper had, which the plaintiff will fail to provide. Members of the jury, for the plaintiff to find Miss Martini liable, they must prove 3 elements. 1, that there's an act committed by Harper. 2, that there's an intent to cause harm to Genesis Petrillo. And 3, that there was harmful contact from Harper Martini to Genesis Petrillo. The plaintiff will not be able to prove any of these elements because today's case was an unforeseen accident, and there's no intent when an accident happens. At the end of today's trial, my co-counsel, Christian Kanduri, will come before you and ask that you find Miss Martini not liable because the plaintiff will be unable to meet their burden. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Before the plaintiff calls their first witness, I'm going to ask everyone to switch to the gallery view. Plaintiff's counsel and your first witness, if you'll come on. Here we go.
Your Honor, the plaintiff would like to call Angel Rodriguez to the stand.
All right, the witness is on the stand and constructively sworn.
Yes, Your Honor. Can you please state your name for the court?
My name is Angel Rodriguez.
What do you do for a living, Angel?
I work as a teacher at Rapid River Valley Elementary School.
When did you first meet Casey Soto and Genesis Petrillo?
Well, I first met Casey and Genesis in 2016 through our mutual friend Drew at a trivia night at Chuggy Sports Bar. A couple drinks in, the three of us were best friends.
What was it like being friends with Casey and Genesis?
Well, they'd been together for years before knowing me, but I never felt like the odd one out. And when they got engaged in July of 2018, I was so happy. They were just the kind of couple that was meant to be together forever.
What happened after Casey and Genesis got engaged?
So we went to Casey's favorite winery, Rosie and Pedro, and celebrated together. By the end of the night, Casey and Genesis had everything planned.
And how did the wedding planning go?
The wedding planning seemed to fall perfectly into place. That is until Harper Martini got involved.
What happened when Harper got involved?
Well, it seemed like all the plans had changed because of Harper. The wedding was supposed to be at Rosie and Pedro, but Harper demanded that it be at Peony Estates, along with a whole slew of other changes.
What was it like working with Harper on the wedding planning?
Well, the more time I spent around Harper, the more it became clear to me that Harper didn't really like anybody who was especially close to Casey.
And what do you mean when you say Harper did?
Whether Harper liked anyone that was close to Casey.
Can you repeat your objection, counsel?
Objection, Your Honor, to lack of personal knowledge to know whether Harper liked anyone that was close to Casey.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes.
Your Honor, this is my witness's rationally based perception. She has known these people for a very long time, and she's been around them multiple times too, so she can tell from her own eyes by witnessing and being with these people what it was like.
I'm going to overrule the objection.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. So, Angel, what did you mean when you said Harper didn't like anyone who was especially close to Casey?
Well, you see, Genesis is one of the most likable people I knew. Harper was constantly criticizing and belittling Genesis. It was honestly really uncomfortable at some points. As the wedding got closer, the conflicts became more explosive. There was definitely some bad blood between them.
When was the next time you witnessed a major conflict between Harper and Genesis?
The day of the rehearsal and rehearsal dinner, June 7th, 2019, Genesis and Harper could not stop fighting. I honestly didn't think they would ever stop fighting that night. At one point, Harper actually said that Genesis should just leave and save their family the headache. Otherwise, she would make Genesis disappear.
What happened after Harper made this comment about Genesis disappearing?
Honestly, things started to get really scary. I saw Harper grab Genesis' arm and pull him to a hallway. A few minutes passed until Genesis came back. It seemed like the bad blood between them had gotten worse.
What happened when Genesis came back?
I had never seen him so scared in my life. What frightened me the most when Genesis came back is that he told me that he was afraid Harper was going to kill him. I initially laughed, assuming that Genesis was joking, but Genesis didn't even smile. It was really clear to me that Genesis was scared of Harper, and by the end of the rehearsal, so was I.
Objection, Your Honor, to the hearsay statements of Genesis Petrillo.
May I respond, Your Honor? Your Honor, under Rule 804B2, which is a statement under the belief of imminent death, this statement should be admissible because it is an exception to hearsay.
May I respond, Your Honor? Your Honor, at no time did this witness say that Genesis felt like he was near imminent death. Also, Ms. Rodriguez would not know if Genesis was in fear of his life because it wasn't stated and there was an action showing that there was fear for his life.
Your Honor, may I respond? Yes. Your Honor, my witness said that Genesis came back saying that he thought Harper was going to kill him. That is clearly a statement under imminent belief of death.
May I respond, Your Honor?
I'm going to sustain the objection.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. Did you ever see Harper again after that incident?
I did. About an hour before the rehearsal dinner, I saw Harper carrying a can labeled pesticide. After that, something really weird happened.
What do you mean when you say something weird happened?
Well, Harper told me that the pesticide can was for Genesis because Genesis was such a pest. I was honestly flabbergasted that she would even say such a thing. She clarified that it was for a cockroach, supposedly, but I was honestly so scared of her at this point.
So what happened after you encountered Harper going to the kitchen with this pesticide?
Well, next was the rehearsal dinner and toast. Genesis and Casey gave beautiful toasts, but Harper's toast was honestly uncomfortable to watch. She kept mocking Genesis and calling him a problem child.
Did anything else happen with Harper that night?
Later in the evening, Harper came and gave a second toast to Genesis. When she made the second toast, she gave Genesis a bottle of wine. It would have really been heartwarming if I hadn't seen Genesis so scared earlier.
Was Genesis the only person to receive this bottle of wine?
Actually, everyone got their own bottles, but the rest of us got bottles of Horizon wine. Genesis was the only person to get a bottle of the Cara wine.
And was Genesis the only person to drink this Cara wine?
Actually, Genesis offered it to everyone at the table, excuse me. I drank some out, but spit it out because it was disgusting.
And did Genesis continue to drink this wine?
Over the next 45 minutes, I had a cocktail or two, and I saw Genesis drink several glasses of wine from the bottle that Harper gave him.
Have you seen Genesis consume this much alcohol before?
I have. I've known Genesis for 3 years at this point, and I've seen him consume a lot of alcohol without even getting a hangover.
So how was Genesis's condition at this point?
So around 11-ish, Genesis got up to dance, and it became very apparent that something was wrong with him.
Why did you think something was wrong with Genesis?
I had never seen him so out of it before. His slurred speech was nothing like I'd ever seen before, especially compared to the amount of alcohol I saw him drink.
Did Genesis continue to drink that night?
From what I recall, I don't remember him drinking anything else. I was also hanging out with our friend Drew, but I did eventually notice that Genesis was slumped over in his seat.
And what did you do when you saw Genesis slumped over in his seat?
I decided to take him up to his room, but things just got worse from there.
In what way did things get worse?
Well, I took him to his room, but by that point he was in awful shape. He could not stop throwing up, and his skin was the paper white color. I kept trying to give him water, but he just kept throwing it back up. So I called 911 and rode with him to the hospital.
What happened after you arrived at the hospital?
I waited at the doctor's office for what felt like hours. I tried calling people from Genesis's family, but no one was picking up.
Did you call Casey?
I have always regretted this, but I didn't call Casey. I was just praying that Genesis would be okay in time for the ceremony.
And did Genesis's condition improve?
No, Genesis slipped into a coma around 8 in the morning, and the doctor told me it was likely due to some kind of pesticide poisoning. I went to Peony Estates to talk to Casey after that because I knew Casey needed to know.
The doctor saying it was likely due to pesticide poisoning.
Would you
May I
repeat
respond, Your Honor?
Would you mind repeating your objection? I couldn't hear the first part.
Objection, Your Honor, to the hearsay statements of the doctor saying it was likely due to pesticide poisoning.
Your Honor, this would be an exception to hearsay because it is a medical diagnosis made by a doctor.
Sustained.
May I strike the testimony?
Yes, the jury is instructed to disregard the statement by the doctor.
Yes, Your Honor.
So what happened after you arrived at Peony Estates?
Well, Harper was the first person I ran into, and before I could say anything, Harper said, Genesis got poisoned. Oh no, we'll have to cancel the wedding. Go tell Casey. Casey needs to know. I found this really odd because I actually hadn't said anything about Harper or about Genesis being sick, much less anything about him being poisoned.
What happened after your encounter with Harper?
I went to Casey's room to explain everything to her. Having to tell Casey that Genesis was in a coma on what was supposed to be their special day together was the second most heartbreaking moment of my life.
And what happened after you explained everything to Casey?
Casey and I rushed back to the hospital as fast as we could. Harper didn't even offer to come. I mean, talk about more bad blood. Her soon-to-be son-in-law was in the hospital and she didn't even show up.
And what happened when you and Casey arrived at the hospital?
Well, when we got to the floor where Genesis was being treated around 9:30 in the morning, the doctors told Casey that Genesis had died. That was the most heartbreaking moment of my life.
Thank you. No further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Your witness?
Cross, Your Honor. Ms. Rodriguez, you were close with Casey and Genesis, weren't you?
Yes.
So close that you were in the wedding party.
Yes.
And while planning the wedding, you noticed there are some disagreements between Harper, Genesis, and Casey.
I did, yes.
But the disagreements were so complicated, you couldn't tell who was mad at who, could you?
No, I really couldn't. There was a lot of yelling going on all the time.
In fact, you admitted that you never got the full story of what happened between them.
I didn't know.
So you don't know who started the arguments?
I don't know.
And you don't know what the arguments were about, do you, Ms. Rodriguez?
No, from what I could see, it was intense.
But overall, you saw Harper, Genesis, and Casey making an effort to keep things cordial.
I don't know about cordial, but I guess they tried their hardest.
They tried their hardest, Ms. Rodriguez. And you didn't know Harper that well, did you?
No, I didn't know Harper like that well.
In fact, you've only met her once or twice?
Yeah, I had met her a couple times through the wedding planning process as well.
But you do know Harper was very involved in the wedding process?
I do. I heard at points she might have been too involved.
So involved that she offered to host the wedding at her winery, Peony Estates.
Yeah, but that's not what Casey and Genesis wanted. I thought that was a little overbearing.
But you would agree that Harper cared about the success of the wedding.
I guess so, yes.
Now, I want to move on to the wedding party at the Black Bear Casino. You were there, correct?
Yes.
And you found Genesis vomiting in the hotel bathroom.
Yes, Genesis did have a lot to drink.
Yes, you attributed this to her drinking too much alcohol that night, which was an unusual behavior.
No, Genesis is a drinker.
Now, I want to move on to the rehearsal dinner. Harper surprised everyone by toasting Genesis.
Yes.
And you saw her give Genesis a fancy bottle of Cara wine in front of everyone.
I did. It honestly, it would have been so heartwarming, but I had seen Genesis so scared earlier that it felt kind of weird.
But Ms. Rodriguez, you said Genesis was relieved by this gesture, didn't you?
He did seem relieved that, yeah.
And you saw Genesis drink this wine?
I did see Genesis drink this wine.
You even took a sip yourself?
I did. It was awful.
And you didn't become sick or have slurred speech?
No.
But you also didn't have several glasses of wine, did you?
No, I had a little bit.
And you saw Genesis order more alcohol, tequila shots after.
I did, but I don't really recall him taking any of those shots.
But drinking a lot was an unusual behavior for Genesis.
No.
And they had slurred speech and a lack of coordination.
Yes, but it was honestly disproportionate to what I had seen in the past. I'd seen him drink way more without even getting a hangover, so his slurred speech was kind of off to me.
But Ms. Rodriguez, you saw him have several glasses of wine and alcohol that night, correct?
I did, but I've seen him drink way more.
Afterwards, you noticed Genesis was getting ill and you had to take him to the hospital, right?
Yes.
And the doctor told you it was likely due to some type of poisoning.
Yes.
But the doctor didn't specify if it was pesticide poisoning or if it was alcohol poisoning, did they?
I don't believe that they did.
And Ms. Rodriguez, you never actually witnessed Harper harm Genesis, did you?
No, I didn't. I just witnessed a lot of conflict between them.
No harming though, Ms. Rodriguez, correct?
Correct.
Objection, Your Honor, asked and answered.
Overruled.
No further questions.
Yes, Your Honor.
Any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor. I just asked that my witness be allowed to step down.
Witness is excused. Call your next witness.
Your Honor, plaintiff calls Dr. Jimmy Kwan to the bench. To the stand.
All right, this witness has been sworn. Let's wait for defense counsel.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, defense counsel can go ahead with his questions.
Please introduce yourself to the court.
My name is Dr. Hyman Kwan.
What is your occupation?
I work as the chief emergency physician at River Valley Hospital in Midlands.
And can you explain to us what a chief ER physician is?
Yeah, I'm tasked with quickly and accurately diagnosing patients who enter my emergency room.
And do you specialize in toxicology?
Yes.
Can you explain to the jury what toxicology is?
So toxicology is a branch of science concerned with how the nature and effects and detection of poisons. And so while I do treat all of my patients as a chief ER physician, I also am usually given the more suspected poisoning cases.
And Dr. Kwan, would you share with us your educational background beginning with college?
I received my BS in biology with a minor in chemistry at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Then I went on to receive my medical degree at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. My residency was at Emory's Department of Emergency Medicine, and following the residency, I remained at Emory to complete my fellowship.
And are you board certified in emergency medicine, toxicology, and critical care medicine?
Yes.
And how many years in total have you been treating people in emergency medicine and toxicology?
About 17.
So, Dr. Kwan, what procedures and methods did you utilize when diagnosing Genesis Petrillo?
Well, during my time at Emory, we were taught the method of differential diagnosis, which essentially is when you're coming to a diagnosis, you have to follow the path that the symptoms are leading you down. The first step would be analyze the first tier symptoms, which include anything that the patient verbally tells us or any abnormalities in their vital signs. And then following that, we analyze the second tier symptoms, which would be from anything like running tests to the patients. Like examples would be your x-rays, your MRIs, really anything that can see beyond the surface level.
And would this can be considered a standard practice in your field?
Of course, it's like the gold standard.
And does this method provide sufficient data for you to reach a diagnosis with a reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
Yes.
And did you reliably apply this method to the facts of this case today?
Yes, I do with all my cases.
So, Dr. Kwan, when did you initially encounter Genesis Petrillo?
So I first encountered Petrillo when they were brought into the hospital by their friend Angel Rodriguez.
And can you describe your initial inspections of them?
Petrillo was vomiting when they arrived. They smelled of wine and appeared to be intoxicated.
Did Petrillo mention anything about their symptoms?
I did attempt to speak with Petrillo about their symptoms, but they had trouble responding.
And upon your initial observations, what did those symptoms indicate?
Petrillo's symptoms of nausea, vomiting, slurred speech, stomach pain, and breathing that was somewhat slower than normal for an average adult indicated alcohol poisoning.
And ultimately, did you complete a full examination upon Genesis Petrillo's admittance to the hospital?
Yes, we always do.
What was the objection?
Leading as to the question that was asked, did you complete a full examination? We haven't had any foundation for that, and it's suggesting that a full examination was completed.
Response?
Your Honor, right now what we're getting to is like they have the initial symptoms, and ultimately what led to that was the examination after like the original symptoms, and we can establish that foundation if needed.
Okay, do so.
Dr. Kwan, after you completed your symptoms, after you recognized those individual symptoms, what then did you do?
Yeah, so after I get their symptoms, I can't just diagnose them based off what I'm seeing, so we want to run a full examination.
And what did this examination consist of?
The examination consisted of taking the vitals and examining the vitals and samples of Petrillo's vomit.
And are these methods reliable and consistent with the proper medical standards?
Yes.
And did this examination change your initial diagnosis of what Petrillo was suffering from?
Yes, it did, because there was a few things that definitely stood out to me that made me believe that it wasn't just alcohol poisoning, it was something else. First, while alcohol poisoning causes dilated pupils, Petrillo's pupils, And when I shined a light into his eyes, I found that they were tearing excessively, which is not a symptom of alcohol poisoning. Second, they exhibited involuntary muscle twitching and incontinence, and both of these are not symptoms of alcohol overdose. Third, while severe alcohol poisoning typically produces a weak but rapid pulse, Petrio's pulse was slow.
Objection, Your Honor. This witness is launched into a narrative, if I may be heard.
Sustained.
And after realizing that it wasn't alcohol poisoning, what then did you do?
I started to suspect that Petrio may have ingested something toxic other than alcohol, like an organophosphate poison. So I ordered a poisons and toxins analysis in addition to the already toxicology report.
And can you describe to us what are organophosphate poisons?
These poisons are commonly found and used in insecticides. They can be very dangerous to humans.
And why are organophosphate poisons considered dangerous?
They inhibit the production of an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase, which causes the nervous system to fail.
And were you able to conclude how Petrio came into contact with an organophosphate poison?
So just looking at Petrio, their skin showed no evidence of coming into contact with the poison. And with the order and time frame in which Petrio's symptoms occur, they were inconsistent with, again, either contact poisoning or even inhalation poisoning. So as a result, I proceeded on the belief that Petrio ingested the poison.
And how dangerous are organophosphates to humans when ingested?
When ingested, they can begin to cause digestive symptoms, including the nausea and vomiting we saw. But as the poisons absorb more, it can begin to affect the nervous system and cause other symptoms such as the contracted pupils and excessive tearing. And in severe cases, it can cause spasms, incontinence, seizures, respiratory constriction, and in the worst cases, it can lead to death if not treated in a timely manner.
And after realizing the severity of this case, then what did you do?
So taking into account that these are the most common used pesticides in the Midlands that can cause people to contract, I immediately administered the antidote for the organophosphate exposure. I also asked the lab to run an acetylcholinesterase test in order with the testing that I had already ordered.
And what happened after you administered the antidote?
So unfortunately, I was too late. A few minutes after I started administering the antidote, Petrio had a coughing fit and a seizure. They fell into a coma and they never regained consciousness. And despite our best efforts to revive them, Petrio passed away in the morning.
And did you note Petrio's preliminary cause of death?
Yes, Petrio's preliminary cause of death was a respiratory failure due to pesticide poisoning.
And before you even received the test results, why did you believe this was a case of organophosphate pesticide poisoning?
Well, the progression of his reported symptoms perfectly matched the expected progression of a pesticide poisoning case. When the person ingests the pesticides, again, they'll exhibit the digestive symptoms and contracted pupils, followed by the severe central nervous system failures like the involuntary muscle movement, seizures, unconsciousness, falling, and leading to death.
And when did you receive the initial test results and the toxicology report?
I received them shortly after Petrio's death.
Would you recognize these reports if shown to you in court today?
Yes.
Your Honor, permission to approach opposing counsel and the witness with the pre-admitted exhibits 5.
Go ahead.
Okay, perfect. So looking at exhibit 5, what can you tell about some of these important results?
So looking at exhibit 5, the initial test results, we can see that acetylcholinesterase level is low and the blood alcohol content is 0.16%. And so the low acetylcholinesterase level indicates that Petrio had been exposed to organophosphate pesticide, which is also confirmed by the toxicology report.
And what does the blood alcohol content of 0.1.6% indicate?
It's enough to cause significant impairment of motor function, slurred speech, and in some people, nausea and vomiting. For this reason, organophosphate poisoning cases, especially those that are mild or in the early stages, can be misdiagnosed as effects of alcohol poisoning. However, a BAC or blood alcohol level content is of 0.16% is extremely unlikely to cause death, seizures, or serious symptoms that Petrio exhibited.
No further questions, Your Honor.
All right. It's your witness.
Your Honor. Good afternoon, Dr. Kwan.
Afternoon.
Now, when you first examined Mr. Petrio, he exhibited many symptoms of alcohol poisoning, right?
Yes.
He was vomiting.
Yes, that's a symptom, but that's a symptom for many different things.
Well, he had slurred speech too.
Yes.
And he even smelled of alcohol, right?
Yes, he had been drinking all night.
And given these symptoms, you initially assumed that it was an alcohol poisoning case, yes?
Yes, alcohol poisoning. Alcohol poisoning generally doesn't lead to death, though, and that's only my initial thought. It wasn't my final diagnosis after seeing all the reports.
That's right. You later changed your opinion.
I gave a different diagnosis after looking at the reports.
Is that a yes to my question?
Yes.
And this was because you believe Genesis had ingested an organophosphate pesticide, right?
All the reports, tests, and analysis I had gone through gave me that as the believed diagnosis.
But isn't it true that organophosphates cause rashes where they make contact with the skin?
Yes, but as I said before, I looked at him and he didn't seem to have had the contact the poisoning didn't seem to have come into contact with the skin or him breathing it in. I said before that I thought he must have ingested it.
Well, if someone ingests organophosphates, they must make contact with the mouth and throat, right?
Yes.
But there were no rashes on her lips.
It would have, with it being ingested, we would have seen more the symptoms of being digested, not so much the symptoms of it coming into contact with the skin.
But Dr. Kwan, you are aware that the mouth has a mucosa layer of dermis, yes?
Yes.
And this is skin.
Yes.
And it came into contact with the pesticides if she ingested it, right?
Yes, but the amount that would have hit the skin on the lips would have been kind of a mild amount. It would have quickly gone into the system through ingestion.
There were no rashes anywhere in her mouth, were there?
I don't believe it would have been inside the mouth long enough to have the effects of contact.
There were no rashes in her stomach?
I did not do the autopsy, so I wasn't able to view the inside of the stomach.
But you did examine the stomach contents, yes?
The stomach contents, yes.
So you did look in the inside of the stomach?
I examined like samples from within the stomach. I didn't examine the inside of the stomach, I guess, like the parts that would have came into contact, or
Now I'd like to direct
the skin is what you're referring to. The stomach.
Now I'd like to direct your attention to the bottle of Cara wine. You believe that Genesis was poisoned by a pesticide from this bottle, right?
Yes.
But this bottle was found in the dumpster.
Yes.
So it's contaminated evidence, isn't it?
It is contaminated, but based off the test that we ran on Petrillo, we do know that he definitely did have organophosphates in him. And as of right now, that is the only item from the wedding that we can tell that had organophosphates as well.
But you can't tell us if the contents of that wine bottle were there intentionally or accidentally, can you?
No, but to a reasonable degree of certainty, we can tell that Petrillo was facing organophosphate poisoning.
And Dr. Kwan, did you ever have access to Genesis's medical history?
I was given as much information as possible within the time frame.
Is that a yes to my question? Did you have access to Genesis's medical history?
Not a complete history.
So you have no idea what pre-existing conditions Genesis had, right?
No.
And you have no idea how those conditions could have affected her at her time of death, yes?
Based on my personal knowledge as like a doctor, and from what I've seen, I do think with reasonable degree of scientific certainty that it was organophosphate poisoning.
Dr. Kwan, direct me back to my question. You don't have any idea as to how her pre-existing conditions could have affected her at her time of death, yes?
Yes, but with all the information given, most likely organophosphate poisoning is the issue here.
Now, I'd like to talk about your treatment for Genesis. You believe that respiratory failure is her ultimate cause of death, right?
Yes.
But Dr. Kwan, did you ever administer a ventilator?
No, I did not.
You are aware that ventilators exist specifically to make a patient breathe when they can't on their own, right?
Yes, but at the time I was trying to administer the antidote, we weren't quite sure how it was going to completely affect him or what stage he was in.
So despite the fact that Mr. Petrillo couldn't breathe, you didn't give him a ventilator?
We were trying
Your
to,
Honor, this is substantially more prejudicial than probative.
Your Honor, if I may be heard.
Hmm.
This goes to show the credibility of the witness. If he is a doctor and he's not following proper medical procedure, it calls into question the credibility of the rest of his testimony. And as such, it is extremely important to this case, and the probative value far outweighs the prejudicial nature.
Your Honor, may I respond? This
Yes.
line of questioning is attempting to put the blame of Genesis Petrillo's death on the doctor himself, who stated specifically and gave the method as to how to diagnose Genesis Petrillo. What they're trying to do is to attempt to push the blame for the death onto Dr. Kwan itself, which is substantially more prejudicial than probative.
Your Honor, if I may respond?
Briefly.
We're not concerned with Dr. Kwan's role in Genesis Petrillo's death. We're simply concerned with whether or not he followed proper medical procedure.
I'm going to sustain the objection.
Now, Dr. Kwan, you didn't consider any other causes of death except for alcohol poisoning and pesticides, yes?
that's correct. With all the information given, those were the two most likely cases. Like I said,
Dr.
with
Kwan, directly
diagnosis.
back to my question, you didn't consider any other causes except for alcohol poisoning and pesticides, yes?
The symptoms led me down to those two possible diagnoses.
Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
Any redirect?
No, Your Honor.
All right, this witness is excused.
Your Honor, if I may call the next witness for the plaintiff.
All right.
Your Honor, we call Casey Soto to the stand.
Okay, you can proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Can you please introduce yourself to the court?
My name is Casey Soto, and my mom is Harper Martini, and Genesis Petrillo was my fiance.
Are you testifying voluntarily in court today?
No, I asked everyone to leave me out of this lawsuit a million times, but I was subpoenaed to testify today.
I know this may be painful to talk about, but how did you and Genesis meet?
Well, in May of 2012, I met Genesis at Rosie and Pedro's winery through one of our mutual friends, and we started dating a month later, and those next few years, they were really perfect, and then Genesis proposed in July of 2018.
When did Harper and Genesis first meet?
I waited until we were serious to introduce Genesis to Harper. After we'd been dating for about 3 years, in 2015, I brought Genesis home for a dinner.
How did that dinner go?
Well, Harper offered Genesis some family wine, and Genesis asked if Harper had anything classier. It was completely my fault for not mentioning to Genesis that Harper owned Peony Estates.
How did Harper react to this comment?
Well, that was really just the beginning of all of the bad blood between the two of them. Ever since that night, Harper would always complain that Genesis didn't respect Harper's work, and from then on, I just tried to make sure that the two of them weren't together often, but that was pretty hard with wedding planning.
You mentioned it wasn't easy when they got involved with the wedding planning. What was Harper's role with the wedding planning?
Well, at first, Harper wasn't super involved, but then she offered to pay for a huge portion of our wedding if we would host it at Peony Estates.
Was Harper aware of your plan to move to France with Genesis at this point?
Harper didn't know about that until May 11th of 2019, the night of our pre-wedding party. We went to the Black Bear Casino and we had a little too much fun, and Genesis told Harper.
What was Harper's opinion of this?
Well, Harper has always been really protective of me, and she was really upset, not to mention all of that bad blood between her and Genesis. Harper told Genesis that we needed to reconsider the plans and that I can't just abandon her.
How did you feel about your fiance and Harper's relationship at this point?
I mean, it was really difficult to see the extent of all of that bad blood between them. I felt really, really torn between the two sides, but I made it clear to Genesis that wherever our relationship went, I would go, regardless of how Harper felt.
Now, can you tell me more about the day of June 7th, 2019?
Everything was going really smooth until Harper snapped at Genesis for arriving a few minutes late to the rehearsal. She was saying how he shouldn't have even bothered to show up. It honestly made me consider calling the whole thing off.
Did you ever tell Harper about your thoughts of calling off the wedding?
I did, and honestly, Harper was ecstatic and said that all I needed to do was give the word. She went on about how I could stay in Midlands and that Genesis was breaking up our family.
How did the rest of that night go?
Better for the most part. Around 10 p.m., Harper gave a surprisingly sweet toast to Genesis and gave him a special bottle of Caro wine.
Did you drink any of this Caro wine?
No, I didn't.
Now, the following morning, how were you notified about Genesis?
Well, I started getting ready at around 7, and an hour later, Harper came in and told me that Genesis was missing. I was sure that Genesis would turn up, but Harper insisted he bailed and that we should postpone the ceremony. And then at 8:30, I heard that Genesis was in a coma.
What did you do once finding out about the news?
I went straight to the hospital, but I got there 5 minutes after Genesis had died.
Where did you go after Genesis died?
Even though Genesis couldn't go with me, I still went to France. There was just too much bad blood. I had to get away from all of it as best as I could.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Defense counsel, your witness.
Cross, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Miss Soto.
Good afternoon.
Growing up, Miss Martini was a great mom, right?
Oh, yeah, I mean, she didn't miss anything special of mine. If I had a soccer game or any kind of event, she made sure she could be there.
She cared about you.
Yeah.
She even sacrificed a lot of her time for your happiness, right?
Yeah.
She would make it to every one of your soccer games
Yeah.
and your school plays.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'd like to talk about your wedding. Your mom offered to host it at her winery, Peony Estates.
Yes, she did.
She even offered to fund a large part of the wedding.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of stuff about financial troubles and things.
Miss Martini even told you that she thought your wedding would generate good publicity for Peony Estates, right?
Yeah, I think that was part of the hope.
And you would agree that good publicity would be good for business.
I mean, yeah.
And Mr. Petrillo eventually agreed to this arrangement, right?
Yeah, we thought that it would be the best way for us to find money to save up for France.
And speaking of Mr. Petrillo, you guys, like you just said, you had a plan to move to France after the wedding.
Yeah.
But you didn't tell your mom about this plan.
I didn't tell her no, but Genesis did accidentally.
Now, I'd like to talk about the night of the rehearsal dinner. You saw Mr. Petrillo receive the bottle of Caro wine, right? And you saw him pour 2 glasses of the Caro wine.
Yeah, he did.
Are you able to say Mr. Petrillo was the only person to drink the Caro wine that night?
Objection, Your Honor. This question is calling for speculation.
Response?
Your Honor, I'm just asking for the witnesses' testimony and what they saw that night, if they saw anybody else drink from the wine.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Yes.
His original question specifically asked along the lines of, do you have any idea or any clue? Those kind of words alone would actually lead towards a more speculative question. If you would like to rephrase it, I'm okay with that.
May I be heard?
Yes.
Your Honor, all I said was, are you able to say?
The objection's overruled.
I'm going to ask you that again, Ms. Soto. Are you able to say Mr. Petrillo was the only person to drink the Caro wine?
I'm not exactly sure who the 2 glasses were for, but knowing my Genesis, it could very much have both been for him.
And after the rehearsal dinner, you went to bed while Mr. Petrillo stayed awake.
Yes.
So you don't know how much more Mr. Petrillo might have had to drink that night.
No, I'm not sure. I was in bed.
Moving on, I'd like to talk a little bit about Miss Martini and Mr. Petrillo's relationship. They argued often, right?
Yeah, it was not a good relationship.
And these arguments typically were about the wedding.
I mean, towards more of the wedding planning, it was more about the wedding, but prior to that, Harper never really thought of Genesis as the best influence or anything like that. So there were other things too.
But you've never seen Miss Martini physically harm Mr. Petrillo, right?
No, just the heated arguments.
No further questions, Your Honor.
All right. I don't know if there was time for redirect. Did you have anything?
No, Your Honor. If I may just ask that my witness may step down from the stand.
Yes, this witness is excused.
Yes, Your Honor. At this point in time, Your Honor, the plaintiff rests his case in chief. I believe at this point in time, if we may ask for 5 to 10 minutes recess, if time permits.
Take 5 since we got started late, and we'll resume in 5 minutes. And I would remind everyone to mute your audio and turn your videos off as the live stream will continue.
Yes, Your Honor.
Is everyone back?
The plaintiff is back, Your Honor.
All right.
The defense is back as well.
And is your first witness ready?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the defense calls Austin Lewis to the stand.
All right.
May I proceed?
Go ahead.
Please introduce yourself to the court.
Hi, I'm Austin Lewis.
What do you do for a living?
I used to work at a winery called Rosie and Pedro's, but I'm currently trying to help run Peony Estates Winery amongst this pandemic. Do you know how hard that is?
Why is it so hard?
Well, not only do I have to worry about people catching COVID, but I also have to worry about pests trying to eat all our grapes since Peony Estates is right next to a swamp.
Now, you said you worked at Rosie and Pedro's. What was your experience there like?
I mean, it wasn't too terrible, but I didn't like the owner, Danny Francasio, all that much. So it made working there a bit of a pain. I just really didn't like how dishonest he was and some of the things he would try to do.
Did anything good come out of working at Rosie and Pedro's?
Yeah, so I didn't have to worry about keeping people safe from getting COVID back then, and I didn't have to worry about being right next to a swamp, but I definitely wouldn't go back because Danny is still there. But another good thing that came out of it was I did get to meet Harper Martini.
And how was your relationship with Miss Martini?
It's pretty good. We work really well together. We became close at Rosie and Pedro's, and she asked me to come work with her at a winery she was opening, Peony Estates. I was so excited when she asked me and jumped at the opportunity to get away from Danny Francasio.
What did your job at Peony Estates entail?
I'm the head winemaker, so I deal with most of the winemaking process while Harper deals with the more business side of things. Overall, it's a really fulfilling job, but some things about the job do make me feel like I've aged about 30 years. I just keep finding more and more gray hairs.
What do you mean by that?
Peony Estates doesn't have the most ideal location. It's located right next to a swamp, which means we have a bit of trouble when it comes to pests trying to eat our grapes. This brought us two main problems: what pesticides we should use and how to store the pesticides safely.
Let's talk about the first problem. What type of pesticide did Peony Estates use?
Initially, we tried using organic methods to keep the pests away, but we soon realized that it wasn't effective enough. That's when Harper suggested that we switch to chemical pesticides to try to get the pest problem under control.
And did you end up switching to chemical pesticides?
Yes, I initially had some doubts about the switch, but Harper was pretty insistent, and I did agree that since the organic pesticides weren't working, we needed to try and do something to control the pest problem. The switch did bring some of its own problems, though.
What kind of problems?
Peony Estates is built on a slope, which means that when we spray pesticides, it runs off from the grapes at the top of the slope to the ones at the bottom of the slope, making them dangerous to eat because they end up just sitting in the pesticides. But I did act accordingly to make sure that this would not be a danger moving forward.
What did you do?
When it comes time to harvest, I rope off a section of grapes at the bottom of the slope. This is where the grapes have the most possibility of being contaminated. The grapes in that section would be thrown out every year. In total, we would end up throwing out about 20% of the grapes every year.
How do you know that the grapes got thrown out every year?
Well, I personally oversee the process. The only time I didn't personally see it.
Hold on, witness. What's the objection?
Relevance, Your Honor. I fail to see how talking about this, the wine and what she threw out goes towards a charge of battery.
May I be heard?
Yes.
Your Honor, the bar for relevance is extremely low in this trial, and as defense, we are able to submit evidence that does not directly pertain to battery to explore all possible outcomes or possibly all possibilities of this case.
Where are you going with this line of questioning, counsel?
We just want to look and make sure that all possibilities have been checked at, and analyze if Peony Estates took all the proper actions.
I'm going to sustain the objection.
Yes, Your Honor.
Do you know if the grapes from the 2018 harvest were thrown out?
Well, I wasn't there to
Your Honor,
personally.
objection to relevance. He's continuing on the same line of question regarding the same form of grapes that you just said was sustained.
May I be heard?
Yes.
Your Honor, these were the grapes that were used in the Caro wine, so I think it is extremely relevant in this case.
I'll allow it.
I'm going to repeat my question. Do you know if the grape, do you know if the grapes in 2018 harvest were thrown out?
Well, I wasn't there to personally oversee the process that year, but I did leave the operation in really good hands and feel certain that they were thrown out.
I'd like to talk a little about the second problem you mentioned earlier. How were the pesticides stored at Peony Estates?
Well, we had a couple of different ways over the years, but our current place to store the pesticides is in a shed that I built 600 feet away from our production facilities.
And were these storage methods safe and reliable?
They were. We were cited a few times, but
Your Honor, relevance again.
What's your response?
Your Honor, again, we're just exploring all possibilities, making sure that we address all concerns of this case.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Yes.
Your Honor, as the plaintiff, we're bringing up arguments towards the case of battery. The defense is just bringing up irrelevant things regarding negligence and not actually addressing any lines of question that will go towards supporting their defense of Harper Martini today.
That objection is sustained.
Yes, Your Honor.
Your Honor. Moving on, I want to talk more about Miss Martini. Did you ever see her poison any of the wine bottles?
No, I never saw Harper put pesticides into any of the wine bottles.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Counsel, your witness, you may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Miss Lewis, you started working for Harper Martini in 2015, is that correct?
Yes.
And Martini offered you 10% share in the company to work there?
Yes, she did.
And you still own that 10% of Peony Estates?
Yes.
And you would prefer that Harper Martini win this case?
Well, yeah, I wouldn't want to see anything happen to her.
Okay, and you acknowledge that the winery will be closed down if the defendant loses this lawsuit?
Well, yeah, because no one would want to have wine from the winery.
And that would be a huge loss to your job?
Well, yeah.
And you'll lose a lot of money?
Yeah, I would, but there's always other jobs out there.
Now, Miss Lewis, losing the estates is the last thing you want to happen. Is that right?
Right. I love my job at Peony Estates and wouldn't want anything to happen to it.
And now, Miss Lewis, you volunteered to testify today?
Yes.
On behalf of Harper Martini?
Yes.
Now, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Genesis Petrillo. You're familiar with Genesis Petrillo, is that right?
Yes.
Martini has spoken about Genesis with you?
Yeah, sometimes.
Martini told you they hated Genesis?
Yeah, but I just figured it was standards in-law things, you know?
Martini told you about the bad blood multiple times, is that right?
She just mentioned that she wasn't a big fan of Genesis, but I just figured it was because, you know, in-laws don't think anyone's good enough for their kid.
Miss Lewis, but just not didn't like, it was hated, correct?
Yes.
And Martini said that they wanted the wedding canceled?
Yes, but again, I just figured it was because she didn't think Genesis was good enough for Casey.
Just not good enough. She wanted, Martini wanted Genesis to disappear. Is that right?
Yeah, but again, I just think it wasn't who she wanted Casey to be with.
Martini stated, if I could push a button and make Genesis disappear, I would absolutely do it. Is that correct?
Yeah, but I don't think she would actually do anything to act on that. She's a really kind person.
But those were the words you heard from Harper Martini, yes?
Yes.
No further questions, Your Honor, at this time.
Any redirect?
No, Your Honor. I just asked that Miss Lewis be able to step down from the stand.
This witness is excused and the defense can call their next witness.
Yes, Your Honor. Defense calls Dr. Kwan to the stand.
Your Honor, Dr. Kwan is a plaintiff.
No, excuse me, Dr. Cannon. My apologies.
No problem. Looks like we have everyone. You may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Dr. Kwan.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Red E. Cannon.
Excuse me. What do you do for a living, Dr. Cannon?
I'm a medical doctor and consultant that specializes in toxicology and pharmacology. I used to be the chief toxicologist from Massachusetts General Hospital in the 90s, and now I'm a faculty position in the Midlands Medical School in the 2000s.
And what educational background do you have to hold this position?
I graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Medical School, in which I received my MD. It was a big step from my small little town down in the South.
And have you ever been published in your field?
Yes, sir. I have published several, and I mean several articles and treatises on toxicology, medicine, and treatment. When you've been in the field as long as I have, you know a thing or two because you've seen a thing or two.
And Dr. Cannon, could you tell us why you're here in court today?
I was hired by the defense to evaluate and review Dr. Hyman Kwan's findings, specifically about what caused Genesis Petrio's death.
And what materials did you have access to when working on today's case?
Well, I had access to such records such as the poison and toxin analysis, the death certificate of Genesis Petrio, the official Midlands alcohol impairment chart, and the chemical analysis for pesticide. Most importantly, I was able to review Dr. Hyman Kwan's report as well as the affidavit of Angel Rodriguez.
And were these materials sufficient for you to come to your conclusion on today's case?
Yes, they were.
And what method did you use in your work on today's case?
I utilized the SPEC method, which stands for symptoms, possible exposures, and cause of death. I review each of these three components for a particular medical report before evaluating its integrity and conclusions. It's a highly respected method for conducting reviews.
Now, I'd like to talk about the first part of the SPEC method, the symptoms. How was it used in today's case?
Well, I looked at the symptoms that Dr. Kwan listed in his report to determine if his diagnosis was correct. Well, Genesis was indeed vomiting, had constricted pupils, and labored breathing, which made me agree, well, at least partly, with Dr. Kwan, that organophosphate pesticides were likely the cause of her symptoms.
Well, you said that you only agreed partly with Dr. Kwan. Why is that?
Well, Dr. Kwan seemed to confuse likely with certain. There was not enough evidence that pesticide was certainly the reason behind her symptoms because crucial information like Genesis' medical records were missing.
Now, Dr. Cannon, I'd like to talk about the second part of your method, potential exposures. What does that entail?
Well, once I determined what was causing someone's symptoms, a diagnosis of sorts, I looked at the evidence to see what kind of exposures could have triggered this cause. In some cases, like genetic disorders, the answer is simple. But in this one, it's far more complicated.
Why is this case more complicated?
Well, Dr. Kwan's conclusions were fine, but only if you were looking at the limited evidence he did. I took some key additional information to considering Dr. Kwan's apparently didn't at the time of making his report.
What facts did you take into consideration that Dr. Kwan didn't?
Hold on, counsel, 1 second. I want to make sure that we haven't lost plaintiff's counsel.
Yes, Your
I
Honor.
lost him on my screen.
Sorry, Your Honor, I was having technical difficulties.
Okay, no problem. Attorney Canberry, could you start over with your last question to make sure that opposing counsel is able to hear the witness's response?
Yes, Your Honor. What facts did you take into consideration that Dr. Kwan didn't?
I took into account where Genesis was before she died. She was at a winery where pesticides are used everywhere regularly. Having worked on many pesticide poisoning cases in the past, I know that even grapes, wine cellars, and numerous other substances are meant to be regularly sprayed with pesticides. This led me to more...
Lack of personal knowledge?
Your Honor, if I may be heard?
Yes.
As to what part of the testimony is opposing counsel objecting to?
The part where he's testifying towards the grapes in the wine cellar and having knowledge about working on them?
Your Honor, if I may respond?
Yes.
The witness just said that he's worked on many pesticide poisoning cases before, and therefore would have knowledge as to where these pesticides were sprayed due to his work on those cases. The personal knowledge for this answer has been laid just fine. Moreover, he also said that he's working with Desky Roche, which is a company that supplies the pesticides that were used in this case.
I'm going to sustain the objection.
Now, how did your analysis vary from the one that Dr. Kwan made?
Well, mine is more accurate. I wouldn't be confident saying, like Dr. Kwan did, that toxins came from the wine. Proving pesticides weren't in other people's food isn't enough. You have to prove it wasn't in Genesis' food, and that she couldn't have came into contact with any surfaces with pesticide.
Now, Dr. Kwan, if you look at probability, which cause would you be more likely to label for Genesis's death?
I would label that her symptoms probably came from general exposure to many surfaces. I mean, you have to take the probability that there's one bottle of wine versus a million different surfaces that could have been poisoned.
Dr. Cannon, I'd like to direct your attention to the last part of your method, cause of death. How did you apply it in today's case?
Well, I utilized this method to realize that Dr. Kwan did not find that there were any pictures that was any details that were in concern, mainly about the organophosphate levels.
Now, Dr. Cannon, were there any details that you considered that Dr. Kwan didn't?
Well, we don't know the organophosphate levels. We don't see a rash on her lips or mouth. If the pesticides were ingested with wine, as Dr. Kwan says, there would have indeed been a rash. And we can't tell if there was any wine in the food or drink in the stomach, and we don't have any data for exactly how much pesticide was in her when she died.
Now, Dr. Kwan, you said that earlier you also used your general medical expertise and determined that Dr. Kwan made a mistake. What mistake is that?
Well, there were many details that were missing. Dr. Kwan's conclusions were hasty at best, but there was a far bigger mistake that he made.
And what mistake is that?
Well, as it is standard procedure, I reviewed Dr. Kwan's treatment methods for Genesis, and again, I found a major problem, particularly regarding administration of a ventilator.
Why are you concerned with the administration of a ventilator?
Well, if Dr. Kwan's diagnosis is correct regarding low.
What's the
Your Honor,
objection?
may be heard.
Relevance.
Hold on, let me have you repeat the objection. I didn't hear it.
Objection, Your Honor, relevance.
Your response?
The relevance for this line of questioning has already been laid through Dr. Kwan's cross, in which we determined that the question of whether or not he administered a ventilator is important to determining his credibility. In Dr. Cannon's analysis, finding that a ventilator was not administered, Dr. Kwan's credibility is called into question.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes.
This line of questioning was already objected to being substantially more prejudicial than probative. Bringing it up in this direct should be offered for the same objection.
If I may respond?
Yes.
I believe that counsel is mistaken. That objection was overruled and it was determined that it was relevant and the full testimony was brought in about the ventilator.
I'm going to sustain the objection.
Yes, Your Honor. Dr. Cannon, after looking at the entirety of the facts, evidence, and data in today's case, what is your expert conclusion as to Genesis's cause of death?
Well, I agree with Dr. Kwan that what poisoned Genesis is most likely pesticide, but I can say to a degree of scientific certainty that the best explanation for how was she poisoned is that she accidentally came into contact with the surface that had pesticide on it.
Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
Your witness for cross-examination?
Yes, sir. So may I call you Dr. Cannon?
Yes, sir, you may.
Dr. Cannon, let's see if we can help the jury understand the things we agree on first, okay?
Yes, sir.
Can we agree that there was the presence of organophosphate in Petrio's stomach and system on the day he passed away?
Yes, sir, there was, but we don't know where the surface that contained the pesticide.
Can we agree that all the remnants of food that were left from the wedding buffet were tested negative for organophosphate poisoning?
This is true, but however, before Genesis partook of her meal, this was not tested before she consumed it.
Your Honor, I will now constructively approach the witness with the pre-admitted Exhibit 5.
Go ahead.
If my co-counsel David Wallace can bring that up, perfect. Dr. Cannon, you recognize Exhibit 5, correct?
Yes, sir, I do.
And do you recognize the blood alcohol concentration of 0.16%?
Yes, sir, this is correct.
And this is not considered a normal level, correct?
No, sir, this is it's a danger zone.
Now, Your Honor, I will now constructively approach the witness with the plea to admit Exhibit 6.
Go ahead.
Can you read out to the jury the positive flag results from both the blood and the vomit sample?
May you please, you mean the positive flag results?
Yes, Dr. Cannon.
This is organophosphate pesticide and ethanol.
Perfect. In fact, you agree that isophenphos or any organophosphate poison is a very dangerous substance when ingested by humans.
Yes, sir, it is.
And organophosphate poisons induce a lower acetylcholinesterase level, right?
Yes, sir, as well as many other things.
And now, Dr. Cannon, you never had the opportunity to physically examine Genesis Petrio's body, correct?
No, sir, my job is to review the findings of Dr. Hyman Kwan.
Okay, perfect. So all the alternative theories that you provide in your report are based on the evidence that was provided to you, correct?
Yes, sir. But I do agree with Dr. Kwan that it is a pesticide poisoning. However, we don't know what surfaces that Genesis Petrio touched in order to receive this.
Yes, Dr. Cannon. So let's talk about those surfaces. So you agree that in some way or shape or form, organophosphate poison would have happened to end up in the stomach, correct?
Correct.
And there are no other surfaces that were tested besides the wine that were tested positive for organophosphate pesticide.
Well, sir, if you think about it, before Genesis consumed any of the foods that she partaken on that night, nothing was tested, meaning that it's possible it could have been in her food, the wine, or any surface that she touched.
But you agree, as we stated beforehand, that no other food, none of the remnants of food that were left at the buffet were tested positive for organophosphate.
Yes, everything that Genesis didn't eat was tested and tested negative.
And you agree that this was a buffet at the wedding, right?
Yes, but you have to agree also that Genesis could have been personally.
And other people ate at this buffet, right?
Correct.
And no one else besides Genesis Petrio suffered the symptoms of organophosphate pesticide because of the food, correct?
This is correct, but we do not know how Genesis Petrio actually got this food.
So, Dr. Cannon, you present 4 alternative theories in your report, correct?
Correct, this is correct.
You include a blood alcohol concentration, allergic reaction, hepatic disease, and not the wine, correct?
Yes, sir, this is correct.
Now, which theory are you most confident in?
Currently, I'm most confident in my 4th theory, and this is the theory that it could have came from something else other than the wine.
Now, let's include Dr. Kwan's theory into the mix, where it came from the Cara wine bottle. Now, out of those 5 theories, which one are you the most confident in?
I do agree that with Dr. Kwan, however, he didn't take into consideration these other 4 possibilities. Why there was.
I need a straightforward answer. Out of those 5 options, which one are you the most confident in?
Objection, Your Honor. Asked and answered, if I may be heard.
The witness hasn't answered plainly. I will allow the question.
May I repeat my question, Dr. Cannon? Out of those,
yes, sir, you may.
Including Dr. Kwan, which one are you the most confident in?
I am most confident in Dr. Kwan's finding. However, I do believe that he did not take in consideration everything.
But so that theory concluded that the poison came from the Cara wine bottle, correct?
Yes, sir. The same bottle that was found inside the trash can and which could have been contaminated.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor. I ask that Dr. Cannon be allowed to step down from the stand.
This witness is excused and the defense may call their next witness.
At this time, the defense calls Harper Martini to the stand.
Okay, the witness has been pre-sworn. You may proceed.
Please introduce yourself to the court.
Hi, my name is Harper Martini.
Ms. Martini, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, I'm originally from the Napa Valley area, but I moved to Midlands for college, and I've basically just been here ever since. Right now, the two most important things in my life are my winery, Peony Estates, and my daughter, Casey.
We'll talk about your daughter, Casey, shortly. Could you tell us about your winery, Peony Estates?
Yeah, sure. I opened Peony Estates back in January 2015, and it's honestly been the most wonderful and fulfilling career that I could have asked for. I truly love what I do. That being said, there have been some rough patches along the way.
What are the rough patches?
Winemaking is a pretty cutthroat industry. We're lucky because the environment does most of the work for us, but competition is pretty stiff. Casey actually had an idea to add this bed and breakfast feature to help set us apart, and it was almost too good for our business. We could barely keep up with booking demands after that.
Now I'd like to talk to you about Casey, your daughter. Can you describe your relationship with her?
I'm a single mom, so naturally Casey is my entire world. Growing up, we always had a pretty close relationship, and the best parts of my days were writing Casey these little notes to leave in her lunchbox before school. Obviously, we're a little past the lunchbox stage now, but we're still as close as ever. She's my perfect little girl. Honestly, Casey's only flaw was her taste in men.
Could you elaborate on this flaw of Casey's?
Well, she had this one really awful high school boyfriend, but most recently, I wasn't the biggest fan of her recent partner, Genesis.
What concerned you about Genesis and Casey's relationship?
I mean, as a mother, I want the absolute best for Casey, and I just didn't feel that Genesis was the best for her. Genesis was an awful influence, and he got Casey into all sorts of terrible situations. One time, Casey was actually hospitalized for alcohol poisoning.
Objection narrative, Your Honor.
I do think that the witness needs to respond to the direct question.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor.
Ms. Martini, why were you concerned about the relationship?
Well, like I was saying, Genesis just got Casey into all sorts of terrible situations. Casey got hospitalized for alcohol poisoning one time because of some bet that Genesis had made her.
Did Casey know how you felt towards Genesis Petrillo?
Yeah, like I said.
Objection calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Ms. Martini, what did you do to try to help your relationship with Genesis?
Well, I talked to Casey about it, and I was
Objection hearsay.
Would you like to respond?
What can I clarify what counsel is pointing out hearsay?
Yes, the statements that Harper made about what Harper said to Casey.
Your Honor, Miss Martini has not said anything that she said to Casey. She simply said she had a conversation with her. She hasn't said any statements that are eliciting the truth of the matter asserted.
Your Honor, this is still eliciting hearsay.
I thought that the witness was about to say something that Miss Martini had said to Casey. And if that's the case, I agree that that would be hearsay unless an exception applies. Is there any exception that would apply?
No, Your Honor. Miss Martini is not going to go into a narrative over a conversation she had with Casey. She was just stating that she'd talked to her before.
Okay, you can continue with your question.
What did you do to smooth things over with Genesis, Miss Martini?
Yeah, so like I was saying, I had talked to Casey a little bit about maybe finding someone else to date, but Genesis and Casey ended up getting—
Objection, Your Honor, hearsay to the statements of Harper talking to Casey about finding someone else to date.
Response?
Your Honor, this is Miss Martini's own statement about speaking to her daughter. It doesn't go to the truth of the matter asserted of whether Casey actually found someone else to date. She just simply said that she told her advice over it.
Your Honor, may I respond?
I agree that it doesn't go to the truth of the matter asserted. I'm going to overrule that objection.
Yes, Your Honor.
Ms. Martini, did you ever, were you ever able to meet up with Genesis?
Yeah.
Over?
Yeah, I decided to schedule a dinner with Genesis in January 2019 because I really wanted to have a good relationship with Casey's future husband. But the dinner didn't really go quite as well as I hoped it would.
What happened?
Genesis mentioned something about a move while we were eating, and I had no clue.
Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay to the statements of Genesis about moving.
May I respond? Your Honor, this is an exception to hearsay under Rule 803.3 because it is the motive, intent, or plan of Genesis Trio to move with Casey Soto to France.
Your Honor, this is not relevant to the case tonight because Genesis moving to France has nothing to do with the charge today, which is battery.
Your Honor, if my witness, may I respond?
The objection is overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor.
Ms. Martini, what happened?
Yeah, Genesis mentioned something about a move while we were eating, and I wasn't really sure what he was talking about until a few months later when he left me a pretty unpleasant voicemail about it.
And would you recognize a copy of this voicemail?
Yes, I would.
At this time, the defense would like to share Exhibit 8 to the screen, noting that as per Stipulation 3, this evidence is pre-admitted.
Go ahead.
Why was the voicemail Genesis left you unpleasant, Ms. Martini?
Well, as you can see in the top left, it was left at 1 a.m. and it sounded pretty hectic and all over the place. That night, Casey and Genesis had gone to some casino, and it sounded like Genesis was drunk when she recorded it. The last line in particular was really hurtful, but the rest basically said that he and Casey were moving to France and that I would never see either of them again.
Mr. York, could you please end sharing Exhibit 8? Ms. Martini, what was your response to this news from Genesis?
I was shocked. As hurt as I was, I did know that Casey still loved Genesis and she wouldn't change her mind. I'm not proud of it, but I did make a last-ditch attempt to instead try and convince Genesis to call the wedding off.
And what was this last-ditch attempt?
I wrote him a note and I offered him some money.
Would you recognize a copy of that note if it was shown to you in court today?
Yes, I would.
The defense would like to share Exhibit 24 to the screen. Ms. Martini, what is this?
That's a copy of that note that I gave to Genesis.
And is this a fair and accurate copy?
Yes, it is.
Has it been changed in any way?
It doesn't look like it, no.
At this time, the defense enters Exhibit 24 into evidence.
All right.
Could you tell the members of the jury about this note?
Yeah, like I said, it was not my proudest moment. I felt that Genesis wasn't good for Casey, and out of hurt and anger, I scribbled this note to see if Genesis would be receptive to it. And I included the $300,000 check because, I don't know, I thought that maybe that amount of money would be enough to help him with his dream of moving to France and convince him to call the wedding off.
Mr. York, could you please end sharing Exhibit 24? Ms. Martini, did Genesis accept this offer from you?
No. He actually gave me the note back on June 7th, which was the day of the rehearsal dinner, and I was kind of relieved about it. I felt so much regret for writing him that note after seeing how happy Casey was the day of the rehearsal dinner.
Could you tell us what happened during the rehearsal dinner?
Well, after Genesis gave me the note back, I knew that he would officially be joining my family. I was so ashamed that it had taken me so long to accept that, but I wanted to try and extend an olive branch to him in the hopes that he would agree to turn over a new leaf with me.
And what was this olive branch?
It was a bottle of Peony Estates' newest wine, Cara. It had a really similar flavor profile to wines that Genesis had absolutely loved when we'd all been sampling them during the wedding planning process, and I was really hopeful that he'd recognize the sentiment and we could move forward together stronger as a family.
Ms. Martini, are you aware that that bottle of Cara wine later tested positive for pesticides?
I am. I heard about that after everything happened. I feel so bad. I have no idea how it could have happened. The only thing I could think of is that a year ago, we started spraying this chemical pesticide to try and stop pests from eating our grapes, and we did use those grapes to produce our 2019 products.
And going back to the rehearsal dinner, did you ever give Genesis this bottle of wine yourself?
Yeah, I actually had the caterer give it to him while I was giving a toast later that night. I acknowledged that we'd had a rocky past, but I was really hopeful for our future together, and I thought that Genesis wanted the same. I turned in pretty soon after.
Objection, Your Honor, speculation.
Okay. So after you gave this bottle of wine to Genesis, what happened next?
I turned in pretty soon after since we had a big day the next day, but I woke up to this panicked phone call at around 2:30 the next morning.
What was this panicked phone call about?
Apparently someone from Peony Estates was being rushed to the hospital. Now, I'd seen Genesis drink a decent amount from the night before when I'd been there, so I went to his room just to see if everything was okay. When I got there, he wasn't there, but the bottle of Cara wine was on the floor and it was empty. After seeing this, I just figured that he had drank too much and assumed that
Objection, Your Honor, speculation.
May I respond?
Yes.
Your Honor, Ms. Martini went into Mr. Petrio's room and there was an empty bottle of wine on the floor. I think it's within her rationally based perception to know that he had overdrank. It was an empty bottle of wine.
I'll allow it.
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Martini, do you know what happened to Genesis Petrio?
No, I figured that he just drank too much and would eventually turn up in time for the wedding since it was pretty early in the morning. The next day, though, we found out that Genesis was actually in the hospital. Casey went right away, but I had to stay back to handle the guests that had started arriving for their wedding. And it wasn't until later that day that I found out Genesis had passed away.
Ms. Martini, you're here today because you're being accused of causing Genesis Petrio's death. What is your reaction to that?
Do you know how hard it is as a mother to see your only child grieve the death of her soon-to-be husband on the day that they were supposed to get married? Because I do, and I would never want anyone to experience pain like that in their lives. It is so heartbreaking to know that there are people who think that I would willingly inflict that pain on Casey. I would never hurt Genesis, let alone kill him.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Plaintiff's counsel, your witness.
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Martini, you've told Genesis that there is nothing you wouldn't do to protect Casey, correct?
Yeah, she's my daughter.
So much so that you were willing to give Genesis $300,000 before the wedding to bribe him out of the relationship, right?
Yes. Like I said, it's not my proudest moment and I regret it.
And you wrote a note along with the $300,000 to give to Genesis late May of 2019, correct?
Yes, I did.
Your Honor, I will now be presenting Exhibit 24, which has already been entered into evidence.
All right.
Now, Harper, in this note, you told Genesis that if he leaves Casey, then the $300,000 would be his, right?
Yes, that's what I wrote.
And then right below that, you wrote, otherwise, I will take you out of the picture the hard way, correct?
Yes, I wanted him to take it seriously, but like I said, it was just out of anger, and I regret writing that note.
And then you gave Genesis a deadline of June 7th, the day of the rehearsal dinner to choose, right?
I did, yes.
So now let's talk about the night of the rehearsal dinner, June 7th, 2019. You had a plan to make peace with Genesis, correct?
Yeah, after he gave me this note back, I realized that he would be joining the family, and I wanted to try and smooth things over as well as I could.
And you were irritated with Genesis that night when he arrived, right?
I was a little annoyed because he showed up late, but I blew it over pretty fast.
But at that moment, you wanted nothing more than for Genesis to be gone, right?
Yeah, I mean, he was the reason why the wedding rehearsal was taking longer than it should.
And after you were angry, you headed to the wine cellar, correct?
Yeah, I did.
And you went to the bottling area to grab a bottle of Cara wine to bring to the main kitchen, correct?
Yes, I had decided that the Cara wine was the best gift to give Genesis since it was kind of short notice.
And you told your caterer, Sam, that this bottle of Cara wine was for Genesis and Genesis only, right?
Yeah, like I said, I wanted it to be a special gesture. I didn't want Genesis to get everything else that the rest of the wedding party was receiving.
And earlier that night, Genesis threw an envelope at you with a note that you used to buy him out, right?
Yes, Genesis gave me back that note, like I said before.
And that same note was the note with the $300,000 you told him to take, otherwise you would take him out of the picture the hard way, correct?
Right, like I said, it was the same note as before, but I'd already gotten the bottle of wine that I had hoped to present to him later.
And Genesis, in fact, even kept that $300,000, correct?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what he did with it, but it wasn't in the envelope when he handed me the note back.
And that made you upset, correct?
I mean, I was a little confused by it, but the night went on. I just wanted to really smooth things over at that point. I felt all the same feelings of regret that I'd felt after giving it to him in the first place.
So later at 2:30 a.m., you found out that someone at Peony Estates had been rushed to the hospital, right?
Yes, I got a phone call from one of my employees.
And even though you didn't know who it was, you immediately suspected Genesis, correct?
Yeah, I had seen Genesis drink a pretty good amount while I was at the wedding rehearsal dinner, so I thought I would just go check in on him.
And so you went to his room, right?
Yes, I did.
And you picked up a bottle of Cara wine on the floor, right?
Right.
And then you proceeded to rip off the label and throw it in the trash, correct?
Yeah, I was really frustrated that it was the morning of Casey's wedding and her husband to be was nowhere to be found. I was just a little aggravated and sleep deprived and irritable.
And you're aware that a lab report was done on the bottle of Cara wine, correct?
Yes, I am.
And you would recognize this exhibit, correct?
I would.
Your Honor, I will now be presenting Exhibit 10, which has already been pre-admitted per Stipulation 3.
Go ahead.
Now, Harper or Ms. Martini, the asterisk here at the bottom indicates that the amount of isofenfos in the bottle exceeds the FDA maximum limits, correct?
Yes.
And your estate, Peony Estates, utilizes bug-off pesticide, correct?
Yes, like I said before, we recently started using bug off on our grapes, and I believe that maybe that could be how it appeared in the wine bottle because we did use those grapes in our 2019 wines.
And you're aware that isofenfos is an organophosphate pesticide, correct?
That's what I've heard, but at the time I wasn't sure of its specific name. I just knew it was a pesticide.
And you're aware that this pesticide is fatal if ingested, correct?
Yes, we did have an incident where an employee left a glass of wine out a couple years ago now, I believe, and we sprayed pesticides in the room where the wine was.
Yes, this employee was Kirby Doolittle, correct?
It was, yes.
And when he took a sip of that wine that was contaminated with pesticide, he almost died, right?
Yes, thankfully, we got him to the hospital in time, and he's still with us and works with us today.
And at that moment, you looked at the glass that Kirby Doolittle drank, and you noticed that any pesticide in the wine wouldn't change the appearance of the wine, correct?
Yeah, I was shaken. I wasn't quite sure why he drank the wine anyway, but that's correct.
And you were aware that you couldn't smell any pesticide mixed in with the wine either, correct?
I was, yes, after that incident.
So on June 7th, 2019, you were aware that somebody drinking wine with the pesticide that your estate uses would not see anything out of the ordinary, correct?
Yes, I was, but after that incident especially, we were extremely careful about our pesticide storage and use.
And on June 7th, 2019, you were aware that somebody drinking the wine with the pesticide that your winery uses would not smell anything, correct?
I was, which is why we were very strict about our pesticide storage so that no accident like that could happen again.
So overall, I'm correct in saying that any amount of pesticide in the wine would not change anything and would not seem out of the ordinary at all, correct?
From that one incident where Kirby drank the wine, it didn't seem like that, but I'm not quite sure if that was like a one-time thing or if that's how it would always be.
So let's circle back to around 9 a.m. on June 8, 2019. You and Casey found out that Genesis had slipped into a coma, right?
Yes, I believe it was Angel who came back and let us know that Genesis was in the hospital.
And Casey went to the hospital, right?
Yes, of course. I mean, it was her fiance who was there.
And your daughter was upset, but you stayed back at the estate instead of going to the hospital with your daughter on her big day.
Well, I had to. There were guests arriving, and I certainly didn't want Casey to have to handle telling them what was going on while her husband to be was in the hospital. I let her go take care of what she had to with Genesis and check up on him, but I had to redirect the wedding guests and let them know that we couldn't have the wedding that day.
And later that day, you found out that Genesis had passed away, correct?
I did, yes.
Miss Martini, you're not entirely upset over Genesis's death, are you?
To the extent that I felt Genesis was a bad influence on Casey, I'm relieved that I don't need to worry about Casey, but like I said, this is not something that I would wish on anyone, let alone my own daughter.
So like you said, you're relieved that Genesis is gone, right?
I'm relieved that I don't need to worry about Casey, yeah.
But are you relieved that Genesis is gone?
Your Honor, asked and answered.
I'll allow it.
Yes, Your Honor.
So Mrs. Martini, you're relieved that Genesis is gone, correct?
Yes, because I don't need to worry about Casey's safety anymore.
And you're happy that Genesis is no longer a part of you and Casey's life, right?
Again, only because I don't need to worry about Casey's safety anymore. I'm heartbroken that Casey is needing to go through this grief process now.
And this lawsuit is a major threat to your business, correct?
Yeah, it hasn't been good for business.
And you would do anything you could to make sure that the court found you not liable for Genesis's death today, right?
Yes, I would certainly like to keep my business, but right now I'm really just focused on my family.
No further questions at this time.
Any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor. I just ask that this witness be excused.
All right.
Your Honor.
Witnesses from the defense?
No, Your Honor. At this time, the defense rests our case in chief, and we just asked for a brief 5-minute recess before proceeding to closing arguments.
That works. Let's meet back promptly in 5 minutes. One of two.
Your Honor, you can see me, correct?
Yes, I can. I don't see anyone else yet, but I will give them a moment to log on and make sure we have our scoring judges before we get going.
I'm here.
I'm here as well.
Okay. And is the closing attorney for defense present as well? I see from the timekeeper, he got kicked out of the Zoom. So let's give him a moment to log back in. Thank you for that on the chat.
Sorry, Your Honor, I had technical difficulties.
No
I was
problem.
thrown out of Zoom.
No problem. One of your teammates let me know in the chat. So we were waiting for you to be able to log on successfully.
Thank you.
And I believe both of my scoring judges are also on. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes.
That's correct.
Okay, excellent. So everybody be sure that you are in speaker view, and I will let you begin with your closing arguments. Once those are finished, we will stay to submit our ballots. So please hang on after the closing arguments have finished.
Yes, Your Honor.
You may begin.
Members of the jury, this was supposed to be a night to remember, a wedding. One of the most sacred events was supposed to bind Genesis and Casey in name and blood. However, on their wedding night of June 8th of 2019, that bond was broken by bad blood. Bad blood that led the defendant, Harper Martini, to intentionally poison the Carol wine bottle that was offered to Genesis with the intent to cause harm. And members of the jury, this was not a simple accidental poisoning case. Rather, this was an act of malice, spite, and resentment towards a thorn in the defendant's backside that she would wish to disappear, the thorn being Genesis himself. And with all the evidence that has been presented today, we can see that our charge of battery is as clear as daylight, that it is more likely than not that Harper Martini intentionally poisoned the Carol wine bottle and gave it to Genesis with the intent to cause harm, and as a result, the plaintiff suffered harm as he passed away on June 8th of 2019. And as the distraught widow Casey Soto testified, that this bad blood was insinuated ever since the defendant laid eyes on Genesis in 2015. It started out as a minor issue of lack of respect, yet that set the foundation for the spiraling of events, as this trial has indicated. The tension between the two was growing insurmountably. As the weddings and the arguments over the rehearsal dinner on June 7th of 2019 was the straw that broke the camel's back. The anger, frustration, and bad blood boiled over as we heard the tragic words from the best friend of Genesis, Angel Rodriguez, who testified that Genesis was terrified of Harper Martini. The intent was laid in the motive to make that form and make it apparent. All that was required of the defendant was to act upon their anger and bad blood and intentionally cause harm to the plaintiff, which they did. The action was meticulous and well thought of. As Angel Rodriguez testified, the defendant told Genesis that they were going to make Genesis disappear. The defendant grabbed the pesticide bottle, the very contents of which were found in Genesis's body, and she poisoned it to remove the pest, which is Genesis himself. It is conclusive that the defendant, Harper Martini, converted her bad blood and rage into action, as the same Carol wine bottle that was offered only to Genesis was tested positive for organophosphate pesticide poisoning. And the defendant was so cunning that even Casey Soto testifies that this exclusive bottle was offered to Genesis and Genesis alone as a special gift. The bottle represented both the little aspect of an ultimatum, as it was Harper's only option to act upon their bad blood and effectively ended Genesis's life. The motive and the intention are clear-cut. The action was purposeful and cunning. The result was conclusive, as Dr. Kwan concludes and has testified as the expert witness, as the premier expert witness today, that the progression of Genesis's symptoms perfectly matched the progression of an expected organophosphate pesticide poisoning case. And he also concludes with a reasonable degree of scientific certainty that Genesis's own physical blood was bad and corrupted with the poison that came from the Cara wine bottle that Harper Martini offered to Genesis. And now the defense has made a case today that there was no intent and it was only an accident, and that there are gaps in the plaintiff's case. These gaps can be filled through all of Harper's statements about intent and his motivation to continue to try to make Genesis disappear. And with all three of their witnesses today, they have not even proven through a single instance of evidence that this was a case of an accident or negligence. Rather, they just added upon to the plaintiff's case that this was Harper's and Genesis's bad blood that led to Genesis's death itself. First, if we look at Austin Lewis, who specifically says that Genesis mentioned not even once, but multiple times that she wanted Genesis to disappear. For example, she specifically said that if she could push a button and make Genesis disappear, she would do so. And with Dr. Cannon, under his own method of SPEC, as I asked him in cross, he said specifically that it was still more likely than not that Dr. Kwan's theory was the most likely, rather than his own other alternative theories about surface or cross-contamination. But let's talk about the surface and cross-contamination through Harper Martini's cross. Harper Martini planned the perfect crime. She already had pre-knowledge through her testing of her employee that the aroma of the poison could not be smelled and would not taste different. And by offering it to Genesis, Genesis would see it as a gift of appreciation, not an unsuspecting threat. And that's what ultimately members of the jury, this case comes down to. Because not even Harper Martini has shown remorse for the actions, rather they are appreciative that Genesis is gone from Casey's life. And furthermore, the fact that Harper Martini took specific actions to remove the label from the bottle and stuff it into a trash can just shows her consciousness of guilt after she committed an unforgivable crime. So, ladies and members of the jury, if we step back and look at the bad blood, this was not an accident. This was full of intent. It showed motivation, and it showed Harper's intent to cause harm to the plaintiff. And by handing the Cara wine bottle to Genesis Petrillo, Harper Martini effectively signed Genesis's own death certificate for them. For those reasons, we ask you to find Harper Martini liable for battery.
All right, defense counsel.
Yes, Your Honor. Before I proceed, I'd like to verify that you can see and hear me clearly. Thank you. May it please the court. There is no intent in an accident. Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury, we are here in court today because my client, Harper Martini, has been wrongfully accused of battery by the plaintiff. Now, they came here and they tried to blame the death of Mr. Petrillo on Miss Martini. They said Miss Martini killed Mr. Petrillo because of bad blood. And while this certainly makes for a convenient story, it overlooks the inconvenient truth that was proven in court today. It's true that Mr. Petrillo and Miss Martini had some disagreements. It's true that Mr. Petrillo's death was poignant and tragic, but members of the jury, it is equally true that what killed Mr. Petrillo was an accident caused at Peony Estates, not an attack caused by Harper Martini. Now, as the defense in today's case, we don't bear the burden of proof. That lies solely on the plaintiff's shoulders. They must prove by a preponderance of the evidence that Miss Martini intended to harm Mr. Petrillo and that what killed Mr. Petrillo was a wine poisoned by Miss Martini. Now, that doesn't mean that the plaintiff's case needs to be downright impossible. If you think that any one of those two elements is more likely than not to be untrue, you must find Miss Martini not liable. Now, members of the jury, you've heard the testimony, you've seen the evidence, and now you know the truth. Miss Martini raised her daughter, Casey Soto, as a single mother. She told us today that she made every commitment so she could do her part to be the best mother she could to her daughter, going to her soccer games, watching her school plays. So in 2015, when she opened her new winery venture, Peony Estates, her daughter was right there alongside her, opening a bed and breakfast, managing the property, and helping her mother achieve her dreams as her mother had done for her. And we also heard from Miss Martini that their relationship did have some rough patches. In 2018, when Genesis Petrillo proposed to Miss Soto, Miss Martini was worried because the person that her daughter was going to marry had gotten her hospitalized once for a bet, openly badmouthed Miss Martini, and snidely criticized Miss Martini's business. So she did what any mother would. She simply advised against it. She never held a grudge. As a matter of fact, we heard that she invited Mr. Petrillo to dinner so they could turn over a new leaf. We also heard that shortly after, Mr. Petrillo was drunk, vomiting in the bathroom, and left Miss Martini a surprise. A voicemail that said he and Miss Soto were moving away to France, whether Harper liked it or not. But members of the jury, you heard that even while Mr. Petrillo was making things difficult, Miss Martini did not stop trying to find a peaceful solution for everyone. Because despite hearing this shocking news, all she asked was for Mr. Petrillo to leave and that she was willing to pay him out of her own pocket to do so. Members of the jury, we heard that despite only doing that, she still felt ashamed because of how it affected her relationship with Genesis and Casey. So for her to kill Mr. Petrillo, as the plaintiff alleges, that doesn't add up. And even though Mr. Petrillo didn't accept Ms. Martini's offer, Ms. Martini accepted Mr. Petrillo into her family. We heard that she took it upon herself to organize their wedding, to make sure that Mr. Petrillo and Ms. Soto had the perfect time. We heard that she gave a touching toast to Mr. Petrillo to symbolize that she was willing to accept her into her new family. And to further add to this, she gave him a special bottle of Cara wine that she selected with Miss Soto. Unfortunately, before this new beginning between them could take shape, Mr. Petrillo passed away. Now, if you've noticed, these events are all that the plaintiff could afford to talk about. But you, members of the jury, know the whole truth, that at the same time that the conflicts in Miss Martini's family were brewing, so was the real cause of Genesis Petrillo's death. You heard how competitive the Woodlands winemaking market is. You heard how it was made more difficult by the fact that Peony Estates was situated above a swamp with insects. We heard from Ms. Lewis that just in their first year, they received a warning from the health inspector for having pesticides too close to their wines. And when Peony Estates switched from organic to chemical pesticides, their problems switched from bad to worse. By the time Genesis and Casey were to get married in 2019, Peony Estates' pesticide problems were tragically beyond repair. We heard from Ms. Lewis that they were cited for 4 different health code violations, all pertaining to pesticide practices and a high risk of contamination for their wines. Members of the jury, we know that nobody at Peony Estates wanted this. Not Austin Lewis, not Harper Martini. That's because nobody has intent in an accident. In fact, we heard from Dr. Cannon that we don't even know how much pesticide was in Genesis at her time of death. We also heard from Dr. Cannon that if you look at the big picture, there are key details that Dr. Kwan didn't mention in his analysis. Key details that the plaintiff didn't mention in their story, because members of the jury, if they have to contend with the whole truth, their case falls apart. Now, when you go back into that jury room today, you have to make a decision on what story you heard today is most likely. And members of the jury, I ask you just that. What is most likely? Is it likely that despite using admittedly contaminated evidence, Dr. Kwan somehow came to the right conclusions? Is it likely that after investing $300,000, millions in wedding expenses, and even more in time spent with Genesis Petrillo, Miss Martini still wanted him dead? Or is it likely that after attempt, solution after solution, Miss Martini really did have nothing to do with Genesis Petrio's death? Is it likely that after years of problematic pesticide practices at Peony Estates, an inevitable but tragic accident happened to Genesis Petrio? Now, the plaintiff came before you and they talked about bad blood. All their witnesses synchronizedly said bad blood. But the fact of the matter is, they're not pursuing bad blood, they're pursuing battery. They need to prove way more than bad blood. And tonight, they've proven neither. Because they have to prove that there's intent. But this is an accident. There is no intent, and there is no action. Find Harper Martini not liable.
All right, and I believe we have time for a very brief rebuttal.
Yes, Your Honor. Members of the jury, in this trial today, you have seen zero relevant evidence that has shown that this case was an accident. Rather, you have continuously seen a pattern of Harper Martini showing her illful intent to remove a thorn from her backside. And as the defense said, that no matter what actions that she took before, she arrived at an ultimatum. That Casey and Genesis were going to move away to France regardless of Harper's wishes. And what did Harper Martini think of that? That she would do anything possible to make sure that that Casey was not taken away from her. And so that arrived at where we're at today. And she took steps to fine-tune a perfect plan and then frame it as an accident. For her guilt and her consciousness of the guilt, we ask that you find Harper Martini to be found liable for that.
All right, thank you to all counsel for today. I would ask the scoring judges to go ahead and submit their ballots. And also, if you would, let me know when they've been safely submitted and received. And while they're doing that, could I have all of the different competitors come back on screen in gallery view? And once the ballots are taken in, we'll give you very, very brief comments. Looks like we have a few more. I'll go ahead and give you all some brief comments while we're waiting on our scoring judges. A couple of things just for everybody. I know that we're all challenged with where we are, but I think if you can do it, I think it's helpful if you've got a ceiling fan or a light behind you to turn it off if it doesn't make it too dark or too unbearably hot, because sometimes that can be distracting for people. On the plaintiff side, Priya, I think you're a very good storyteller. You sounded like you were telling the jury a story rather than a lawyer giving an opening argument, and that's pretty hard to do. So I wanted to pass that along. I thought all of you handled your objections pretty well, and in particular did a better job that I saw probably in the first round of making sure that I got to hear your objection and the other side got to hear your objection. That's just a function of Zoom, that sometimes there's a slight delay. And so if you can try to build that in, I think it helps everybody to resolve things more quickly. Definitely some good witness roles in this round. I thought the attorneys did a good job of handling some of the more difficult witnesses. So those were my only general comments. I thought y'all did a really nice job.
I finished and submitted my scoring sheet, and I wanted to reiterate that point that this time I really saw amazing prowess in both sides in combating the objections and having a good response, and when things didn't seem to be going your way, to have a good backup plan, which is really impressive and shows just how well prepared overall both teams were. Good job, everyone.
I've also submitted. I guess I'll give a brief comment. You'll notice in I did fill out my written comments, and I tried to be as specific as possible. But you might notice that I kept repeating a few points. It really boils down to this. It's not just your facts, your information that's important. Perhaps almost equally as important is your presentation of those facts. And where this really kind of maybe hurt, I'd say, both teams a little bit, was on cross-examination, when I felt that some witnesses were explaining just a little too much and were being a little too combative, especially the experts. And I would say that's unfortunately the most egregious time to appear that, because as an expert, your credibility is your most valuable currency. I mean, we can sympathize with character witnesses pretty easily, or at least more easily, I should say. But as an expert, you have to appear and sound as impartial as possible. And if that means conceding just a few points, then so be it. On the other hand, you don't want to concede too much, but I think the directing attorneys should maybe take the opportunity to redirect and rehabilitate you, and make sure that whatever you were trying to say in cross-examination eventually does get out. That's something that I think I want everyone to be wary of. It's not just the information that gets out. It's not just which side gets the most facts that support it. It's how you present those facts.
All right, thank you. Could I have one of the scoring judges check to make sure that the ballots were received? I don't think they have my text number because I didn't get response back last time. And so I'm hoping maybe it would come to one of you.
On the ballots themselves, it turns to green when they've been safely submitted, and mine did that, but we can send a confirmation email. Is that what you want?
Yeah, Archibald, did yours as well?
Yeah, it's green. I can text Elliot.
Okay, I'm sure he got it. But if you two wouldn't mind, everybody else can go, but if the two scoring judges would wait just until we get that confirmation. Participants, any questions for us? Are you ready to get on with preparing for tomorrow?
Thank you so much for judging, Your Honor.
All right, y'all did great. Have fun.
Thank you very much.
For your time.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Are y'all working the tournament tomorrow?
All right. He said we are good to go.
Awesome. All right. Well, maybe I'll see y'all tomorrow. If not, it was nice to sort of virtually see you.
Nice to meet you. Bye.
Okay. Y'all take care.